Well, good to see everybody. I'm going to introduce Rachel now, and I'll spotlight her. But Rachel Matthews is on staff at our sister church in Champaign, as well as a licensed clinical counselor. And she's here to offer the second in our series of seminars on trauma to talk about what we can do about it. So, Rachel, thank you again for being willing to do this, and welcome.
Thank you, David. Lord, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things that we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Amen.
Last week, I hope you got the message, if you were here, that discussions or processing of trauma need to be done in a sacred place, a place set apart with intentionality to provide that sense of safety and trust needed when there is trauma present. Trauma, by its very nature, depletes us in ourself, our environment, and our relationships, depletes us of trust. Remember how easy it is for our brain to go offline when we're under stress. That was Dan Siegel who taught us about the hand as the brain. So our practices that keep us in the present moment, mindful, can help us stay grounded and online when we feel a little wobbly or feel that fear is taking over. So I will offer another exercise that my son taught us, another mindfulness exercise. My son taught me this one. It's very, very simple. He uses it in the shower if his mind starts to wander. He looks at a single spot in the shower and is mindful of it. That is, he notices everything that he can with his senses about it, and his frontal cortex goes back online, and he can stop ruminating, stop his mind racing, or whatever's happening at the moment to make him anxious, and he can focus again. So I'll share my screen, and that will help us with this process.
Oh no.
All right. That's a little traumatizing for those of us who aren't used to it. All right, so I would like for you to relax and ground your feet, push them on the floor, relax your body, take a breath. And as it's coming out, notice the breath on your mouth. And you can find a single object anywhere in your house with you, or you can look at the rows on your screen as your single object. This will help you stay in the present moment, avoid criticizing yourself as your mind wanders. And so just notice that object. What does the surface of the object look like? Is it shiny or dull? Does it look smooth or rough? Does it look soft or hard? Does it have multiple colors or just one? What else is unique about the way this object that you are focusing on looks like?
Okay. Something else in the room.
And take a deep breath and breathe it out. And we can come back together. Anytime you find yourself wandering, take a look at that object and reconnect to the present. So I'll give a start with just reminding us again of some of the symptoms of trauma. Trauma is an overwhelming emotional response to a terrible event that impacts our mind, our body, and our faith.
Somebody should have told her about that.
Yeah.
I might ask that all of you mute yourself, and you'll be able to focus on the screen a little better.
Rachel, if I could just jump in, every time you shuffle or turn pages, it's rasping against your microphone.
Thank you.
Yeah, so.
It's because it's on top of my computer. I'll put it over here to the side. Thank you. Okay, so let's look at the emotional symptoms of trauma. Feeling out of control, anger, fear, anxiety, sadness, shame, dysregulation, either too much emotion, too little emotion, either hypervigilant or hypo aroused, a little too numb, as it were. That's all there are many other emotional states that we could be in. And then the physical symptoms of trauma can be somatization, which is a complaint that's located in your body with no perceivable cause of the problem. Sleep disturbances, gastrointestinal disorders, cardiovascular issues, neurological, musculoskeletal, I'm sorry, it's hard to say, respiratory, dermatological, rashes, urological problems, incontinence, as well as pain, substance abuse disorders. And some people are resistant or culturally unable to discuss emotional elements because of whatever structures in their culture handle emotions. And so some of these folks will experience more somatizations or physical ailments. They'll just hurt in certain ways. And now cognitive symptoms would be like errors in dealing with the situation, triggers, excessive guilt. There might be Stockholm syndrome, where you actually feel great feelings of love or idealizations of the perpetrator of your trauma. Trauma include induced hallucinations or delusions, intrusive thoughts or memories such as flashbacks or triggers, feeling different, disassociating, like you're not really there when you're doing something that's connected to a traumatic trigger. And then behavioral would be like avoidant of anything. Could be a thing, could be a smell, could be anything. Self-medicating, taking painkillers or trying to rev up yourself, like self-medicating. People get on motorcycles and drive really, really fast. That's also a form of self-medicating. Compulsions, impulsivity, high risk or self-injurious behaviors, aggressiveness, reenacting portions of the trauma. And then finally, social symptoms can be avoidant of social situations or people, isolating, attachment issues, problems, and relationship problems. All of those can be symptoms of trauma. So it's and you can see how if the trauma is hidden and the person hasn't shared that they've been traumatized, these kinds of symptoms can look like many other things. So sometimes it's hard to even discover whether or not someone is focused on or is behaving that way because of trauma. So this is a nice little, this is I mentioned last time the window of tolerance, and the window of tolerance is a really good visual for me to help in a lot of different situations, whether it's trauma or other mental diagnoses, or even just helping myself moderate my own being and balance my living. So you can find ways. This represents your state, your emotional state, but it can also represent your physical state or any of those kinds of symptoms. Think about your life in terms of your activity level, and then I'll connect this to the trauma part. There are times when you're lethargic, perhaps you're sleeping or you're taking a nap. My Apple Watch would say if I'm hypo aroused, it's time to stand. If you're in this sort of hypo place for too long, there are times when you can be very active. Maybe you're on a morning walk, a heated argument, or intense moments, and you might be hyper aroused, more activity than your usual state. And then there's your ordinary activity level where, I might stand once an hour if I'm working, because I have a very sedentary job, and ordinarily move regular amounts around my house. But my friend who works at the university is going to have a higher level of activity because she walks all the time from building to building and classroom to classroom. So her window of activity, as in, I'm using this as an example, is going to be higher and bigger. So the activity can parallel your, be a parallel to your emotional state. So our normal emotional state of being, how much tolerance we have of even of hyper states or hypo states, we live kind of in this regular place. Trauma can make this window of tolerance much smaller, and we can have maybe some of us might react in a more depressed, lethargic place. Some of us might react in more anxious, vigilant states, manic. Whatever it is, trauma will narrow that window of tolerance. So our stress level will go up faster. There's less room for stress in the window of tolerance. Our stress level will go up faster. And sorry, I've got my hand wrong. And our thoughtful brain will flip quicker. That's my explanation on the window of tolerance. I think Dan Siegel is the one who explains it more fully, but it's easier for me to think of it that way. It works for me in my own relationships. If I've had a stressful day, I'm likely to have, my window of tolerance is likely to be depleted. And so I need another one of those states to balance things out. Maybe I'm hypo-aroused, and so I need more hyper-arousal to help my window of tolerance get bigger, wider. Mental illness across the board robs us of the ability to have more control over the window of tolerance without treatment. All for the symptoms that I've mentioned from trauma can be placed in either, all of those symptoms can be placed in either a hyperarousal or a hypoarousal state. And people are trying to widen their window of tolerance, and they will self-medicate. And so then you will have some kickback on either end of the window of tolerance because of that. Okay. And so maybe I should pause right here and see if there are any questions about that, since I used my own way of explaining the window of tolerance.
And if you have a question, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm going to go on then. And certainly we're going to have questions at the end. Okay, somebody asked me last week about post-traumatic stress. And I looked up online. I think this article was mentioned by Wild. And there are what are considered pre-traumatic risk factors that it's not, there has been a conversation about whether or not, if you've been traumatized before, whether or not you're more conditioned to have PTSD, for example, or somehow or another a complication in processing your trauma. And it's not that you've had the trauma before that increases your chances. This particular article mentions that the research shows that it's really whether or not you have maladaptive cognitive coping skills, or maybe some other psychological trait that does not help you cope with the trauma. How we frame trauma, what we think about it, those kinds of things are going to have more of an impact than whether or not we've experienced a trauma before. Also, Dan Siegel talks about, and not in this article, talks about our attachment styles, that if we've grown up with anxious or avoidant attachment styles or chaotic attachment styles, we are more likely to be adversely affected by trauma. And also our resilience, how high our resilience level is, whether or not we continue to ruminate about a stressful event, or we have the ability to feel confident about going into things. That makes a difference also about whether or not we are more likely affected by a traumatic experience. So good resilience training can help avoid PTSD as well as major depression, and also based on Siegel's stuff, strong attachments also. And as an adult, even if you've had, the attachment studies show that even if you've had chaotic or anxious attachments growing up, if you have strong attachments as an adult, that can actually benefit you in handling trauma and other life experiences. So relationships, empathetic, positive relationships are helpful in many situations, overcoming mental distress of any kind, not just trauma. So let's move on into care responses after a traumatic event. There are, if you experience a trauma, the earlier you get connected to processing it, the better you are going to handle it. So our Presbyterian Disaster Assistance has groups of people that go in. They're called first responders after an accident. First aid. The Red Cross also has first responders. They go in early after a disaster. And one of the most important things that people do is, after providing the sense of safety, get people food and shelter and all of that, is just to listen to people and to provide them with the form of listening that doesn't re-traumatize them. A lot of times our media will be right there on the scene of a crisis and they'll be interviewing people, but the kind of interviewing they're doing doesn't modulate or balance people. It's more, you can get more trauma, re-traumatized sometimes by the media response to a situation. So employee assistance programs that go into work situations and allow people to talk and to normalize systems and to educate people about experiences that they might have to normalize that. Those are all very positive ways of handling trauma. Communicating about treatment possibilities and wellness activities that can help people cope. That's important. Providing referrals for professional help and really providing hope. You're not alone. You're not at fault. This is not your fault. Recovery is possible. My son experienced a trauma in college, and I won't talk about the trauma, but I will say that there were certain things that were put in place immediately afterward that really helped him. The college had a counseling center. They had trained people to respond to trauma. They knew things to say. They knew steps to take. We were contacted. So those kinds of things that I went down there to be with him. The college campus provided a hotel room for me to be down there so I could just be there as he processed stuff. I think we ended up paying for it, but the fact is that was available to us if we had needed it. So just those strengthening of the strengths and the resources available to a person is a very important thing to help with in trauma. So also last time we talked about attending to moral injury. So I wanted to give you a referral about this particular article. This article is written in 2005 by one of my colleagues down in, I think he was in Georgia, did a lot of work dealing with the effect of soldiers' battle mind and the kinds of moral choices that soldiers have to make in battle. Two the quotes from his article stood out to me. Many who succeed in being excellent soldiers rely on strength, logic, will, and sucking it up when it comes to any feelings that get in the way. In many cases, they do so by not being in touch with the sensation of their own bodies and thus losing the value of their own incredible intelligence, the kind that is honed in life and death situations, where soldiers learn to listen to the slightest sound changing around the perimeter or the hair standing up on the backs of their necks. In a similar way, these same men find they are not very successful in relationships because they haven't learned to translate the sensations of their own body and feelings into information about interpersonal relationships and to articulate this learning into intimacy with their partners. Similar skills are involved, but when their physical lives are not at stake and they are not in a war zone or a test of physical survival, the information is used differently and for very different goals. Also, this one other quote from that article, which I will read. We need support to bring our soldiers home psychologically, spiritually, and interpersonally so that they are able to again enjoy and contribute to the world of which they are a vital part. But this is not a given. Out of 3 million combatants who participated in the Vietnam conflict, nearly 1/3 suffered PTSD at some point after deployment. And then he gives a book called Traumatic Stress, The Effects of Overwhelming Experience on Mind, Body, and Society. Even 20 years later, 15.2% of veterans continued to suffer from PTSD. This compares with a 2% incident in the US population at large. Other complications involve loss of capacity for being vulnerable, of enjoying intimacy with one's spouse and children, and a tendency toward various kinds of addictive compensations, including drug and alcohol abuse. This is another significant contributor to community problems. The estimated cost of alcohol and drug abuse to American business is $81 billion in 1 year. This is 2005. 37 billion is due to premature death and 44 billion to illness. Alcoholism causes 500 million lost workdays annually. To the degree that this is continuing damage to veterans who have not yet recovered, it underscores the strategic importance of the chaplain's corps, both for the war effort and for the return home. So that was kind of sobering when I went back and looked at that article. I have some resources that I've listed at the end, which I included that article. It's from Infantry Magazine. Mental health support. I think this is an important part of the conversation of mental health and trauma and mental health. We want to encourage disaster preparedness. We want to advocate for wellness activities, and some of those are like yoga, exercise. And the reason yoga is so important is it's not just that it's about relaxing your body or exercising your bodies. Those two are also side effects of yoga. It's about the way yoga teaches your mind to be intentional on certain things and to be balanced and careful, attending to the pain at just the right moment for you when you're doing a particular pose. So that's why yoga is an important wellness activity. Mindfulness meditation is important, and some prayers are more mindful than others. Talk therapy that supports the window of tolerance. And by one of the things that you can do is use subjective unit of distress levels when you're thinking about your window of tolerance. You can say, okay, that my pain level is maybe from a 1 to a 10. Right now, my pain level is a 5, and 5 is okay. But if my pain level gets to a 10, then I'm in one or the other ends of the window of tolerance. It can be pain level, can be stress level, whatever it is that gets us out of that window of tolerance. But so when you're telling the story of your trauma, if all of a sudden you find your anxiety is shooting through the roof, then you need to stop, and you need to bring it down with an activity that helps you to be more mindful, that you're in the present moment, that you can relax and be calm. Grounding techniques and coping strategies are important to be taught. Identifying triggers and creating plans to manage them. So one faith community that I was in had individuals who found it very difficult to hug. There were several people in the community that had anxiety issues or trauma issues or autism. They were on the spectrum, so they didn't like being touched. And instead of going up and saying, "Can I hug you today?" or whatever, because there was the other side of that, the congregation really liked to hug. They made a pact, and it was in their bulletin that, okay, if you see somebody with a snowflake, you know not to hug them. I guess they were going on the Frozen theme. I don't know, but that was what they did. And so they had these very attractive snowflakes you could pick up and put on when you were walking into the congregation. You could give them a wave or a bump, find another way than hugging to handle that. That was a very supportive community in a lot of ways. So, okay, so I want to move into treatments. There are a few, when you're thinking about, when you know you have trauma and you're looking for treatments, you know that these will probably be some of the ones you will want to focus on. Evidence-based treatments are ones that have been researched, and the scientific community has shown outcomes that are positive. There are other treatments that are not yet fully researched, I think, but these have been researched fully. So you know that you're in good hands if your therapist is going to be utilizing some of these to help you in your trauma. So trauma-informed CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, the woman that founded EMDR was named Francine Shapiro, and that is stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a form of psychotherapy that is now considered evidence-based. It wasn't for a long time, so you'll still find articles that say, "Oh, this is cutting edge," or whatever. My description of this treatment is that the therapist, the psychotherapy process mimics the rapid eye movement, like in sleep when you dream, your eyes will be moving back and forth. When you look out at the ocean and you watch the waves, your eyes move back and forth. That's a calming thing. It's part of you're wired to process stuff that way. The therapist will direct you to have a lateral eye movement while you're thinking or telling the story, and your anxiety might be going up, but at the same time and that lateral eye movement is reconnecting parts of your brain and your nervous system as you're doing that. So also there's other things that are used. Tapping. You will maybe tell your story while you're doing tapping. There are other tapping points that people will use, or there's an audio stimulus that will you'll put earphones in and you'll hear beeps, or you'll feel a vibration, and it's lateral. So you're going back and forth at the same time as you're trying to unblock information processing systems in your mind and relieve the distress that the trauma causes. I can tell you about my mother's experience with EMDR. I've not ever experienced it myself, but my father is a Vietnam vet. And when we 4 children were like under the age of 11 when my father was deployed and went off to Da Nang. And she told me that during this time, there was, and I remember this actually because of my mom's experience at the time. She was freaked out, but she said that one day we were living in New Mexico. My there was a man dressed in uniform who came to the door and knocked on the door. And that she thought it was the military coming to inform her of my father's death. And she responded in a very, overwhelmed way. She was crying and carrying on. And she could not get that image of the military man coming to the door out of her mind for years. And I did not know that actually until I was in counseling classes in early 2000s, and she was having a lot of grief experiences. And this particular image was one that she and her therapist worked with the EMDR to get the intense emotional responses out of her while she was with regard to this particular image. In fact, this guy that came to the door was a Boy Scout leader. And I remembered it as a postman. I remembered the incident, but I didn't remember that it was a Boy Scout leader. But and she told me at the time I was in counseling, when I was telling her about, there's this treatment, she says, I've experienced this, kind of one of those things. And she said it was very, very helpful to her. That for some people, they really like this treatment because there's less talking. You think about the incident and you might talk about it, but when you're actually doing it, you're thinking about it and moving your eyes and whatnot. So that's helpful to some people. So another one of the treatments is sensory motor psychotherapy. Pat Ogden is the woman who's known a lot for this particular treatment. You can go on the sensory motor psychotherapy website and find out more about this. It addresses the physical as well as the psychological effects of an adverse experience. It targets your posture, your physical actions or dysregulations. If you've had, some people who are trauma, they get the trauma lodged in their body. And so they spend a lot of time working through redoing the movement that's stuck or the particular part of the body and talking about it and slowing things down. There are, I want to go back to the trauma-informed CBT. So some of those CBT beliefs, some of the beliefs that are looked at in CBT will include views about the world that trauma creates in people. Some of those statements, those self-talk statements are, the world's a dangerous place, people can't be trusted, life is unpredictable, or views about yourself, I'm incompetent, I should have reacted differently, it's too much for me to handle, I feel damaged, and also views about the future, like things will never be the same, or what's the point, I'll never get over this, this is hopeless. Those are all beliefs that are not entirely true. Even if when we feel this way, it's not always the way it is. So the trauma-informed CBT will help people look at those particular beliefs and find other ways of thinking about them in terms of their current life. There are other expressive therapies. I mentioned tapping. Psychodrama is one, and it's a very structured way that a lot of family therapy or communities that have experienced trauma might go through psychodrama together. The therapist recreates with the client the whatever has happened, and they work through it and change and dramatically change things about it to help people move into a place of healing. That's about as much as I can say about it. Unless you have seen it or experienced it. Bessel van der Kolk has done a lot of work in tapping and psychodrama. He's a psychiatrist who's done a lot of work with trauma. Art therapy is also one that is used as in an expressive way when people are traumatized. I don't know if any of you all have been watching Vienna Blood on PBS. It's a mystery show, and the Freudian psychiatrist is connected with the police investigator, and just one of the ones I saw recently, a child was given a pad of paper and asked to draw their trauma. And so that's kind of art therapy there. But there are other therapies for trauma, evidence-based treatments for children in trauma, other than art therapy is not the only one. A big one is TheraPlay. Phyllis Booth is the founder of the TheraPlay Institute, and that's a really good one for children. Okay, so religious and faith beliefs and responses of faith communities of practice can make a huge difference in how one processes a traumatic event, and how easily one seeks treatment. Depending on attitudes towards morality and war, a person might have trouble coming forward to disclose their struggles. Some communities glorify war, but the experience of the person is anything but a sense of glory. And so there's a disconnect that way. Moral injury, mentioned that earlier, is a term that's been developed for trauma experience that has to do with a person's belief that they've done something specifically in war that's considered damnable, or something's been done to them in the same way. Shame and guilt are emotional responses related to moral injury. Faith communities have perpetuated domestic violence and adverse childhood experiences, which lead to trauma in their views of women and their ways that they've overlooked abuse of children by their religious leaders. We've heard about the Roman Catholic Church, but we have mission schools in the in the history of the Presbyterian Church. I'm sorry, I'm running my papers over the microphone. That have been abusive. We all need to take responsibility for power dynamics in our relationships in this way. Mary Gail Frawley O'Day is a psychotherapist who's done a lot of work in the sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. She wrote a book called Perversion of Power, and that's a resource that I'd like to share with you. I think she's that those kinds of things, more we can be aware in the religious community of how we perpetuate power dynamic issues, can really help or hurt the today I am having trouble talking, perpetuating abuse of power, especially with other vulnerable people like our older community or our children. So the faith community that is welcoming, non-judgmental, encourages wellness practices such as mindful meditation, good nutrition, exercise, and is hopeful in its approach to care, can assist in the trauma recovery. I will even say that a faith community concerned about systemic injustice is one that will be concerned about how trauma has affected its members, since untreated trauma is passed on from generation to generation, and faith communities can perpetuate passing trauma or healing from trauma in a positive way. So either a negative way or a positive way. I've often thought about the Lord's Supper as a response to trauma. It's a resilient response to trauma. It was passed down from generation to generation, and it produces life and not death, unless the fencing of the table produces death. So, that goes out on a limb, maybe, that we don't have time to really talk about. But I just think that that's a ritual response to a traumatic event in a community's life that is, for us that believe in the resurrection and a renewing of life, it has been really positive. Okay, I'm getting closer to the end here. Locally, what are some of our resources here? We have quite a few resources available to us here in Champaign-Urbana. We have quite a few social workers and licensed clinical professional counselors who are trained in trauma-informed therapy. Many certified trauma specialists, or maybe they're certified in particular specialty like EMDR. I've looked on Psychology Today and I Googled, I know some of them, but I Googled in Psychology Today, I asked for trauma-informed therapist, and I got a list of 8 on my first search. And there were more than that, because the way Psychology Today does its search process, it brings up different ones every time you search. So there are many folks who are comfortable in incorporating Christian counseling and spiritual concerns if you ask. So they may not be trained specifically as a Christian therapist, or maybe they don't list that, but if you ask, they can tell you whether or not they're comfortable talking about spiritual concerns with your healing process. We have many trauma resources available to us, but counselors have they're sort of in a profession that doesn't allow them to get their name out there. Maybe they have a very private, they do have a very private work, but they also have the lack of marketing skills. Some of them, they didn't go to school to be a marketer, but they're maybe in private practice and they're not getting their name out there. Maybe they have a lack of time. They have confidentiality concerns or dual relationship concerns. So unfortunately, that means that someone who has a need to have trauma addressed in their life will have to do a little work on the front end to help either go to Psychology Today and do some research on Google, or you can check out the member services feature on your insurance card. On the back, it'll say behavioral health or something like that. Psychology and behavioral health concerns are considered medical health, and they are covered by your insurance at some level. That was a law that was established, and it is something that still people don't realize, that mental health is medical health. So and also there are some telehealth services. So you might feel really uncomfortable. Too many people in this community. It's a small town. Maybe you really would like to go to Chicago, but you can't drive to Chicago. You can go to a therapist in Chicago with telehealth. Or somewhere else in the state of Illinois. So mental health practitioners have been able to transition online care fairly easily, and they have been supported by our state legislatures and insurance companies to do that. However, there's the other downside, is that some therapists have trouble with this format because there are some things lost in the online setting. Maybe the in-person cues are missing online, or there's a fear of safety issues that the individual might not be able to handle themselves if they're triggered. But if you're seeking help with an online therapist and have concerns about that, you've got to talk with your therapist about that. They actually want to know, and they want to help. There are specific things that online therapists can do to ensure more safety in their clients. So maybe they'll have somebody in the room with you, or they'll have you research, your hospital number or your 911 number or something on the front end. So you have those available to you, or they have that available to them so that they can call those numbers if something happens in the therapy. So trauma-informed telehealth therapists will work with you on the front end to increase safety and security in your network. So all those things are really positive, and they're right here available to us in this community. And finally, I just share with you these resources that are just so packed with information about trauma and mental health issues. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk is a very readable book. He wants lay people to read it. It's just really good. Mindsight by Dan Siegel, the same way. Great book. And then the I mentioned some of these before from last time, chapter 3, and understanding the impact of trauma from the NCBI bookshelf. I just Googled to get this particular article, and it's just well done. It's got a lot of answers to questions in a very readable way. Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman is an older book, but if you've had experienced any kind of sexual trauma, or this is a really good book. She's a cognitive behavioralist. And then more resources. I've got some listed here with moral injury and PTSD. Mary Gale's book on the sexual abuse in the Catholic Church is there. And then the treatment resources that I mentioned, EMDR, they've all have websites and have written many books on these kinds of therapies. These particular treatments have. And then resources to last week questions that I used today. And I just want to remind us of Matthew 11 and use this as my closing verse, and we can open up for questions. And I've really talked longer than I did last time. I'm so sorry. Come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Amen. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that. And before we begin asking questions, I remind you, you'll need to unmute yourself. Two, this has been recorded, and so I'll edit that and get it posted, I hope, by Tuesday. All the resources that Rachel presented will be at the end of that. You can pause the video as it's posted on the church's YouTube channel, and you can write those down. But I'm going to take my pastoral prerogative here, Rachel, and ask the first question. Would you have a cautionary bit of advice to say about those who call themselves Christian counselors? The way the evangelical world understands it, I understand, is very different from what you presented today. So would you have a word to say about that?
Yes, I think Christian counselors try to mold, and this is not true. See, it's a blanket statement. Some people consider me a Christian counselor. I'm not. I'm a spiritually integrated psychotherapist, but I'm a Christian, and I do have knowledge of that particular faith perspective. What I see, and this is such a simplification, and I do injustice to some people by saying this, but I see Christian counselors as having a set of beliefs that they think are right, and taking issues, mental health issues, and framing them around those right issues, rather than starting with the person. And many of them will say, I'm client-centered, and they've been trained. Many of them have been trained in, in colleges, and trained just right alongside, and are licensed clinical professional counselors and social workers. So I think it was true more in the past than currently, because our state licenses people now, and are required to meet particular standards. So I would say, if you saw a Christian counselor and that was important to you, to make sure that they were a licensed clinical licensed clinical professional counselor, or a licensed professional counselor, or a mental health social worker, licensed social worker. I think there are licensed marriage and family therapists. All of those have to meet standards. And one of the standards is, you do not impose your beliefs on somebody else. And that is the key. As a spiritual integrated psychotherapist, I do not take my beliefs and make them yours. I listen to you and help support the belief system that you have. If it's getting in the way of your treatment, we can talk about it, and I might give you suggestions, but in no way am I supposed to take away your sense of will or your value or cultural perspectives. So I don't know if that's helpful, David, but
No,
yeah.
that's very helpful. I think you phrased it very well about the differences. And so looking for licensing by the state, yeah, is the way to go. I think we do well to be careful when we're seeking help, to know what the person who presents themselves as a counselor, what their perspective is going to be. Yeah,
Absolutely. And that's true. Yeah, that's true.
and you need to unmute.
Thank you, Rachel, very much for what you're doing. I have just been listening to some podcasts by Resma Shah, who is a Black trauma specialist working with Black people. He goes into companies and institutions working on diversity issues and insists that Black and non-Black employees not work together at first, that white folks need to work on their issues and Black folks otherwise. And then he used the word that you just used, re-traumatizes. So my question to you is whether it's at just general relations with African Americans, or whether it is walking, as you say, into a disaster situation where there has been immediate, sudden, unexpected, overwhelming disaster. What are tips about what we are apt to do to re-traumatize inadvertently? And what can we do not to re-traumatize? Just tips to keep in mind.
I think when somebody who's been in a trauma starts to tell their story, there's a tendency for them to just totally like throw it up. And that can be re-traumatizing, because really what therapy does is modulate the telling of the story. And so the brain doesn't flip again. I think that in telling, so what first responders do when they go in is that they're trained to be empathetic and to listen, to not judge. Those are all important things as well, but also to modulate, to notice if a person is starting to get overextended or excited, or to help them to breathe and to relax and to be present with those mindfulness practices. Those are all very important things to do when you're engaged in trauma, because you can have secondhand trauma. So the other piece to that is self-care. So when you are hearing the stories, to make sure that you care for yourself, that you don't cross boundaries because you're trying to fix a situation that can't be fixed and make it worse. That's just a few really quick things that I could say about that. But yes, I would say to have mental health first aid training. If you want to be a first responder or do any kind of disaster relief care, to go ahead and get mental health first aid training. And our Presbytery Disaster Assistance Program offers people to come in and teach congregations how to have that kind of training. I don't have that training. I never was in a position to get it. I did go through a kind of a Red Cross first responder training, but it wasn't the mental health first aid training. And they do help you to notice when somebody's just has blanked out, help you know some of the signs of when somebody's back in a trauma, has started dissociating, or maybe becomes violent because they're out of themselves. They've dissociated and they're back in the trauma in the past. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think those would all be things that I would be careful about.
Other questions? All right. Well, Rachel, thank you again very much for being willing to do this. We've appreciated so much your time with us. This will be posted on the church's YouTube channel in a day or so. And remember, next week, we're going to shift gears a little bit to talk about housing discrimination. And then on the 30th, we'll have the third in this series on trauma and caring for ourselves in the midst of it. So again, Rachel, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.